They called him the experiment. Not a man, not a myth, something engineered. While other athletes jogged through childhood, Alexander Karelin stormed into existence like a thunderclap, built not in years but in fear. Picture a child born with the body of a gladiator and the silence of a shadow. While his peers still learned to balance on bicycles, Karelin was dragging logs through snow-covered Siberia, forging muscle where others had play. There's a difference between being born gifted and being born terrifying. Karelin wasn't a product of chance. He was the consequence of Russia's obsession with dominance, a machine with veins. Before he knew what fear meant, he was introduced to pain. Not as something to run from, but something to harness. His father, a truck driver, taught him toughness the way Russians do, with frost-bitten winters and no mercy. And from that place, deep in the heart of Siberia, something began to grow, something beyond human comprehension. At 13, he took up wrestling. Within months, coaches were speechless. He wasn't just beating kids, he was demolishing them. The mat became a graveyard of hopes. Opponents didn't lose, they were humiliated. You don't coach that. You don't teach brutality. You're born with it. Every monster has an origin story, but this one didn't climb out of darkness. He rose through discipline. His workouts were the stuff of Soviet legend, pulling tractors through snow, sprinting up hills with logs chained to his back, lifting partners above his head like sacks of flour. Not once, not twice, dozens of times. And not for show, for war. He trained like the world was ending, like every second he wasn't in agony was a betrayal of greatness. And in that process, he became something unclassifiable. Wrestlers feared him. Coaches worshipped him. The regime saw him as a symbol. This wasn't just about winning gold. Karelin was crafted to be a message to the world, that Russia could create something so unstoppable it made you question human limits. They didn't call him the experiment as a joke. This was Cold War sports psychology turned into flesh and bone. His body, a slab of granite. His hands, massive enough to engulf heads. His legs, capable of lifting 300-pound men like they were paper. And behind all of that, discipline, silence, no trash talk, no theatrics, just eyes that stared through you, as if measuring your soul for weight. The perfect storm. By the time he was 20, he had already begun carving his name into the bones of Greco-Roman history. People didn't train to beat him. They trained to survive him. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't fast. He was inevitable. Like a glacier, slow, crushing, unchanging. He didn't chase opponents around the mat. He stood in the center and waited for them to come to him. And when they did, he broke them. Physically, psychologically, spiritually. This wasn't sport anymore. This was something else. This was a man who had learned to turn suffering into supremacy. And the world had no answer. What made him even more terrifying wasn't his dominance. It was his mind. Karelin wasn't a brute. He was a scholar of pain. He studied angles, momentum, leverage. He could calculate the perfect moment to strike with terrifying precision. One mistake, and you were airborne. He popularized the Karelin Liftthe, a move so savage it seemed to mock gravity. Imagine a 130-kilogram man hoisting another 130-kilogram man above his head and slamming him down with bone-rattling impact. That wasn't supposed to be possible, not in that weight class. But Karelin made it routine, as if physics were his servant, not his limit. No one remained undefeated by luck. Karelin racked up wins like a machine, going 13 years without a single loss. For a full decade, he didn't even give up a single point, not one. Opponents walked in knowing they wouldn't score. It wasn't about winning anymore, it was about dignity. Could you last the round without being humiliated? Could you walk off the mat on your own 2 feet? Olympic golds, world titles, they piled up like dominoes. But Karelin didn't care for trophies. What mattered was perfection. Not just to win, but to erase doubt. To dominate so fully, questions died. Legends began to spread. Stories of him wrestling bears, training in snowstorms, breaking bones with a whisper. Truth? Exaggeration? No one cared. What mattered was the aura. He was no longer just a man. He was a myth walking among mortals. Even his opponents admitted it. There was something otherworldly about him. Some said he felt no pain. Others said he didn't blink during matches. The scariest part? He never lost control. No rage, no panic. Just a cold, surgical destruction of every dream that stood across from him. He turned Olympic mats into crime scenes, and he left no witnesses. But the world doesn't like dominance for too long. When someone wins too much, they stop being admired. They become hunted. Critics whispered, "He's not human. He's too perfect." There must be something artificial. Steroids, doping, Soviet secrets, anything to explain away the impossible. Karelin ignored it all. He didn't respond. He didn't complain. He just kept winning. Until one day in the year 2000, after years of terrorizing the sport, Karelin stepped into the Sydney Olympics for what would be his final match. A decade of invincibility behind him. A nation's pride on his shoulders. One more war to wage. Across from him stood Rulon Gardner, a humble American from Wyoming. No Olympic medals, no legendary status. Just a farm boy with grit. On paper, it wasn't a match. It was a mismatch. Gardner had no business even sharing the mat. But fate doesn't read resumes. That day, something changed. Karelin couldn't find the rhythm. Gardner held firm. Point by point, cracked. The experiment had met its flaw. The arena didn't erupt. It gasped. Because history didn't just shift, it shattered. This wasn't an underdog victory. This was a thunderstrike to the soul of every fan who believed in invincibility. Karelin, the silence in his corner was louder than. He looked stunned, respectful, almost apologetic. Because even in victory, he understood. He hadn't beaten a wrestler. He had dethroned a god. And gods don't fall. They collapse empires when they do. That day, the myth bled, and the world held its breath. But Karelin, he didn't rage. He didn't make excuses. No interviews laced with bitterness. No stories of injury or sabotage. Just one line. "I lost to a man who did not make a mistake." The grace in that sentence shook people more than the loss. This wasn't a man broken. This was a man complete. Because only someone who has mastered pain, war, and legacy can lose and still stand taller than anyone else in the room. Karelin walked out of that arena not as a defeated champion, but as something rarer, a warrior who had nothing left to prove. Even after retirement, his presence never dimmed. His story became a scripture for Russian athletes. His training routines became rituals. His mindset became philosophy. In gyms across the world, people whispered his name, not with awe, but with fear. Karelin was no longer a competitor. He was a standard, a ghost that hovered over every mat, every match, every moment someone dared to dream of dominance. Fighters studied his matches not to learn technique, but to understand commitment. His life wasn't a highlight reel, it was a doctrine. A brutal reminder that greatness is earned through suffering most will never choose. He never transitioned to entertainment. No acting, no WWE, no hunger for fame. Karelin returned to his homeland, stepped into politics, and kept the same discipline that had once turned his fists into weapons. But the mat never left him. The echoes of struggle, the sweat of 10,000 hours, the faces of men he broke, they followed him, and he carried them all like medals you can't wear. He didn't seek revenge on fate, he accepted it. Because for a man who turned the impossible into routine, losing once wasn't failure. It was the last page of an epic carved in stone. And in that final page lies the deepest lesson. What made Karelin terrifying wasn't that he was unbeatable. It was that he pushed the line of what was humanly possible so far. Everyone else looked small. His dominance wasn't a fluke. It was the outcome of pain repeated so often it became pleasure. In Karelin's world, comfort was weakness, and suffering was the forge. He didn't wrestle to win, he wrestled to become. That's why his shadow still looms. Because we've seen champions, but we've never seen another force that made even victory feel like survival against something prehistoric. For over a decade, he was a storm you couldn't stop. You could prepare, you could strategize, but once that whistle blew, it was already over. He didn't just win, he suffocated. He erased space, hope, movement. Every opponent had a plan until Karelin touched them. Then they had panic. It wasn't speed. It wasn't trickery. It was inevitability. He wasn't chasing you. He was waiting, like a lion that doesn't run because it knows everything comes to it eventually. And when it does, it doesn't roar. It devours, quietly, completely. And that silence, that was the real sound of power. They say time humbles all giants. But Karelin was never arrogant. He didn't need to scream. His body spoke. His discipline shouted. His stare crippled. His silence burned hotter than any speech. You couldn't hate him. You couldn't mock him. You could only survive him. And even that was rare. To this day, Rulon Gardner is celebrated, but never with the same awe. Because Karelin's loss wasn't Gardner's victory. It was fate's reminder that even gods sleep. But when they're awake, they walk differently. Karelin didn't walk the earth. He marched through it, and every step left cracks in its foundation. And maybe that's what separates the truly legendary from the merely great. Legends don't chase glory, they redefine it. Karelin never needed fans. He didn't perform for applause. His life was a test, a brutal, honest test of will, not just for himself, but for the world watching. Could you train like him? Could you suffer like him? Could you carry the burden of expectation, legacy, and perfection without letting it crush your spine? Most couldn't. Most cracked. But Karelin, he embraced it, wrapped it around himself like armor. And when the spotlight burned the brightest, he stared into it without flinching. There's a lesson in that kind of silence, in that kind of pain. Because in today's world of fame-hungry athletes and social media warriors, Karelin's ghost stands taller than all of them. Not because he talked the loudest, but because he never had to. He knew who he was. And the world did too. He didn't just defeat men, he made them question themselves. Not just on the mat, but for the rest of their lives. That's not sport. That's psychological warfare. And it's why, decades later, when people speak of the experiment, they don't laugh. They whisper, as if he's still listening. And maybe he is. Somewhere in Russia, maybe he still lifts, still trains, still lives by that code forged in frost, silence, and pain. Not to compete, not to return, but because that's who he is. Because when you've built your life on struggle, comfort feels like betrayal. Karelin doesn't chase past glory. He doesn't mourn that final loss. Because in truth, he never lost. Not really. He walked away undefeated in the only category that mattered, being feared, respected, and remembered. And that's why the name Karelin isn't just etched in history, it's engraved in the nerves of every man who ever stood across from him. In Karelin's homeland, utterly alien to the comforts of modern sport, you didn't relate to him, you respected him from a distance, like a mountain that doesn't move, even when the world quakes around it. Even today, sports science dissects him like a puzzle. They measure his grip strength, analyze his bone structure, simulate his training regimens with technology he never had. And still, no answer. No formula explains how one man could dominate such a brutal sport for so long, against so many, with so little margin for error. Because it wasn't just biology, it wasn't just work ethic, it was belief. A kind of belief so obsessive, so absolute, it scared people. Karelin didn't train to win. He trained because he didn't know how to live any other way. Winning was just the byproduct. Some call him a relic, others a prototype from a lost era. But anyone who stood across from him, even once, would tell you this. Karelin wasn't a wrestler. He was a reckoning, a force that made you realize how fragile your will really was. Champions walked in with confidence, plans, fire. They walked out shattered, changed, quieter. And not because they lost, but because they saw something few humans ever see. The peak, the ceiling, the end of human potential standing there, breathing, judging them. That's what Karelin was, the final boss in a game you didn't realize you weren't ready for. And there's poetry in how it ended, not with a knockout, not with blood, but with a quiet, tactical match where a single slip became history. Because gods don't explode, they fade. They return to dust, to silence, to legend. And in that silence, Karelin became eternal. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need to come back. He had already outlived his rivals, his era, and even the rules that tried to contain him. His story became the standard by which fear itself was measured. And to this day, when coaches speak of sacrifice, they point to Karelin. Not with admiration, but with warning. His opponents would speak of the weight. Not his physical weight, but the pressure. The moment you felt his hands on you, everything slowed down. Like gravity doubled. Like your body forgot how to resist. Not because he was doing anything magical, but because his presence broke the spirit before the body. Wrestlers train their entire lives just for a chance to score a point on him. A point, not a win. That was the currency of greatness in Karelin's era. One moment of resistance, one crack in the machine, one sign that you were more than just prey. Most never even got that. And what made it even more haunting was how calm he was. No screaming, no trash talk, just cold, focused destruction, like a man flipping switches, not smashing walls. And that calm, that was more terrifying than any outburst. Because when someone hurts you and feels nothing, you realize you're not in a competition. You're in a demonstration, a lesson, a reminder that somewhere out there, discipline still lives, wrapped in flesh, smiling slightly while it buries you under its expectations. That's who Karelin was, a philosopher of violence, a tactician of suffering. And the silence between his moves was the loudest lesson of all. The media called him the experiment, but in truth, he was the control. He was the baseline against which all ambition was measured. You could run faster, lift heavier, win titles. But until you outlasted Karelin's legacy, you were chasing shadows. He didn't chase legacy, he became it. He didn't talk legacy, he lived it, bled it, buried it into the mat with every suplex and pin. And the scariest part? He never needed to explain it. He never asked for credit. Because monsters don't ask to be believed in. They just exist, and they wait, silently, until the world forgets and dares to relax. But the world hasn't forgotten. Not really. In every gym where a young wrestler picks up their first weight, somewhere, somehow, someone mentions the name. Not to inspire, to warn, to set the bar so high, it almost breaks the sky. And in that moment, you realize, this isn't just a sport. This is a lineage of pain, carved out by a man who refused to be normal. A man who took discipline to such violent heights, it became artistry. Alexander Karelin didn't just dominate a sport. He changed the temperature of it. He turned wrestling from a contest into a crucible. And maybe that's what scares us the most, not his size, not his strength, but what he represented. A version of Karelin was what we all fear we could become if we truly gave everything. He was the result of what happens when a man chases excellence so ruthlessly, he loses every excuse along the way. And the rest of us? We stay behind, making peace with mediocrity, applauding from the safety of the crowd. Because to walk Karelin's path means walking alone, in the cold, with no applause, no shortcuts, and no end. And yet deep down, we know he's still out there. Not Karelin the man, but Karelin the myth. Lurking in gyms and dreams, in the backs of every champion's mind. A silhouette that never fades, a reminder that perfection once walked among us, and it didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't even slow down. It just marched forward, buried its opponents, and vanished like smoke. Leaving behind a question that still haunts sports, strength, and the human spirit. What happens when fear itself wrestles back? The answer wears no crown, claims no throne, and holds no mic. It simply stares. And if you look long enough, it stares back.